I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Welcome to what I think is going to be a really exciting episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson. I'm a naturopathic doctor in Ontario and Canada. And today I am joined by none other than the period fixer, Nicole Jardim. Nicole, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I'm excited that you and I have finally been able to connect. I've been a fan of yours for a long time. I think we share the same sense of humor when it comes to memes, to be perfectly honest.
I think we do. I was actually going to say that to you before we started recording, that I think that your Instagram is absolutely hilarious and I enjoy it immensely.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we share the exact sense of humor. But Nicole, the reason I wanted to invite you on the podcast is partly that your relatability when it comes to women's health, but also your just drive to get good information in the hands of women around getting control of their hormones, understanding their period as, we'll call it, a vital sign or something that needs to be paid attention to, and your advocacy for women for having the right knowledge to make good decisions, especially around things like medication. I would love if you could sort of open us off by walking us through how you got to this point in your career. I'd love to hear about your book. So I'm going to let you kind of take it away and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I was definitely the most unlikely period, but here we are. And for me, it all started unbeknownst to me at the time when I was 11. My dad suddenly passed away in a plane accident, and it completely threw my life into turmoil. My mom's father had just died really suddenly 2 months prior to that. So it was just really, really traumatic for my sister, my mom, and I. And, I really didn't have any kind of help. There was no psychological help. There was nothing really. We just kind of had to get on with life. It was really messed up when I look back at it. And so I remember living through that trauma, and then it just sort of followed me for years. And I remember getting my period. Everything seemed kind of normal for the most part. And then as a few years went by, I started having all these issues. It started to get more and more painful. I started to bleed through all my clothes, my school uniform. Being a teenager is terrible enough as it is. That was really traumatic for me. And just got to the point where I was having those issues. And then I started to notice that my period would come every 3 or 4 months. I finally went on the birth control pill. When I went on the pill, I thought, oh, this is amazing. This is going to solve all of my problems. And it did for a moment. I felt like a year or so, I went back to having what I felt was what I used to have, a normal period, a period that came, every 28 days. It was not heavy. It was not painful. And then I started to notice all of these side effects that came after being on the pill for a year or two. And again, I was back in all the doctor's offices again. I was seeing a dermatologist because I had melasma all over my face. And he was like, well, this happens when you're pregnant. I don't know why it's happening to you, but whatever, you can just take this face cream. And I thought, okay, cool. And then I'd be in and out of my gynecologist. It was like a revolving door. I had chronic UTIs. I had chronic yeast infections. Sex was painful. All of these things were happening to me. I was 21. I just thought there's no way this should be happening. It does not feel normal or right. And so I was in and out getting medications for those issues. I was seeing a gut health, a GI doctor, because I had terrible GI issues. I was chronically constipated, very bloated. I was always in pain. They diagnosed me with IBS. They did a colonoscopy, and they said, you're fine. You just love that. It's like you have all these problems and then they say you're fine, and then you're sent on your way. And that was basically my life for a number of years. And then, as I said before we started recording, I started to, just get really frustrated and fed up. And then the final sort of nail in the coffin was getting a UTI medication, and I was allergic to it and ended up in the ER. I was bright red from head to toe. I was, covered in hives, and I had a 104-degree fever. And they did all the things to address the reaction I was having to this medication. And the next day I just thought, I cannot do this anymore. This is crazy. And so a friend of mine suggested her acupuncturist, and I just thought, oh, whatever, I have nothing to lose. And I went and saw him. And for the first time in what felt like 5 years, someone said to me, oh, I think I know what's going on here, because I had gotten a lot of blank stares and wait and see and come back in 3 months and here, try this estrogen cream for your painful sex, or try these dilators, things like that just never seemed like they were addressing any of the root causes. So I saw him. He said all of these great things to me. It made a lot of sense. He was the first person to say, I think the birth control pill may have something to do with what's happening here. And at first I didn't believe him. And eventually he convinced me and I went off of the pill. And that was, really the turning point for me. I feel like that was sort of the second moment where I thought, oh, okay, this is what it's like to function without being on a medication that's really making you not well. And that was the beginning for me of this journey. And, fast forward 10 years, I started to learn more about women's health. I went to school, I studied to be a health coach, and I ended up doing more training in women's health. And it was like my calling. It was meant to be. So here I am. And, gosh, it's almost been 20 years now. And I decided to write this book almost as much for me as I did for all of the women who have come to me over the years and who've reached out to me, because my 21-year-old self was completely clueless. I used to go to the doctor and make up a date of my last period, because who the hell knew when your last period was? I certainly didn't. And I didn't really care. I never understood why I needed to know what was going on with my body. I was the person who would take my body to the doctor like I'd take my car to the mechanic. It's just, they'll fix it and send me on my way. And so now I obviously have discovered the inherent value in really understanding your unique body and your cycle. And this is what I do. And I'm obsessed, as many of us are who do this work.
Yeah, it takes that level of obsession, I think, for us to do this day in and day out, doesn't it?
It really does. I know, it's true.
It's interesting because as you were talking, I was seeing sort of these two thoughts that I had that as you were talking. One is so often when women are in their late teens, right? And when I think about your or at least my life when I was in my late teens, so much of my symptoms or the things that I was experiencing at that time in my life were getting chalked up to my circumstances, right? So, of course, you sleep all the time. You're a university student. Of course, you are struggling with weight management. You're a university student. Of course, you're sad. You're a university student, right? Rather than being oh, yeah, we injected you with the Depo-Provera shot 8 months ago, and we've been doing it every 3 months since, and there's a big connection there. That never really dawned on me until years later, where I'm hey, remember how I used to have to have a nap every day for 4 hours, and how gross I felt all the time? That we chalk so much up to a woman's life as being the root cause of her symptoms, rather than what's going on with her hormonal health, even if we've hijacked her hormonal health with medication.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I could not agree with you more. When I think about this, it kind of makes me crazy, because the medical gaslighting that happens as a result of this, where so many women have come to me over the years, I imagine you too, and said, yeah, I went to my doctor about the pill that I was on, or the Depo-Provera, or whatever, the IUD or the implant. And I was having all these crazy symptoms and they seemed really abnormal to me, but my doctor said they're all completely fine and totally normal for this type of birth control. And they just sent me on my way. And this could be a life or death situation, which is what's so upsetting to me. Like, for instance, with blood clots that form while on the pill, for instance, or on the NuvaRing, in someone who is susceptible to that. And yet we're just chronically told to dismiss our bodies, the signals that are coming from them, and just pretend that they're not happening. It's akin to the fire burning in your house, and you don't even bother with alarm. You don't call the fire engine. You just sort of close the door and you leave for work, and then the house burns down. I mean, it's crazy to me, but that's exactly what's happening. And it's so frustrating to witness this. In fact, I'll talk about this more as we get into the interview because I had a doctor's appointment last week and it had been a little while since I'd been to a regular doctor. And it was unbelievable. I still can't even get over a week later what the hell happened to me. And I wrote a book on this stuff. It's just crazy. So I know what it's like for so many women to go to the doctor and to feel like they're having all these symptoms and they really don't feel right. And their intuition is literally screaming at them, only to be told by the expert that they're totally fine.
Yeah, I like that term gaslighting. Like, I think that that's like, because it's such a good, it really sort of like sets the severity up, because we always think about like, people can think about like psychological gaslighting and be like, that's like the worst of the worst, right? As
Yeah.
far as relationship dynamics go. And yet we see it showing up in medicine every day and maybe with most interactions. And yet to like be able to label it that, I think is really important, because the women do feel like they are crazy. They do start to question their own reality. They do start to think, well, it can't be from that because that one person told me it's not. And it creates this barrier for them being heard and feeling understood, and then ultimately getting care. And it's not until you have like an anaphylactic reaction that we're like, oh, maybe we need to like rethink this strategy.
Yeah, exactly, right? Why is it that we have to have emergency situations with our menstrual cycles or with our health to be taken seriously? That just is so infuriating on so many levels because the ignoring of all of these signals until, like you said, we're in anaphylactic shock or we have a blood clot is just not okay. Not okay.
Yeah, it's like the heavy menstrual bleeding's not a big deal until you're so anemic and that you pass out and bang your head on the the bathtub, and now you need
Yeah.
stitches in your head, and now someone's going to care about your menstrual bleeding. But just telling your doctor that you were bleeding through all your clothes wasn't good enough.
Right? Oh, the heavy menstrual bleeding. It's like, how much is enough when it comes to the heavy bleeding? It's
At
crazy
what
to
point
me.
would you consider
Yeah,
this an episode of Carrie, right? Or like,
like a major problem. And when you think about the fact that iron deficiency is a cause of heavy menstrual bleeding, and then heavy menstrual bleeding causes iron deficiency to become worse. And it's a whole cycle. And it could, in some cases, just be solved by testing, doing an iron panel and possibly supplementing with iron. Usually it's more than that. But in many cases, it could just be that. And it's just, for me, it's so frustrating because it's just ignored and it's just perpetually normalized as if sort of the female population were just born this way. We're just born to
mhm,
have problems. And,
mhm.
I think that's another really big issue that we're constantly dealing with. The pill is the cure all to all of these problems. And, we've been lied to for such a long time about how our bodies function, or we should just fare our bodies so that we never ask questions, or rather ask the right questions. And, that all these problems we're dealing with are just a normal part of being a female or someone who menstruates, as if our bodies are like a design flaw or something. Our menstrual cycles are just a flaw. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah, and that like that language around it just sort of gets perpetuated, right? Like I remember, and I don't ever really remember talking about my period fondly. Probably until I was like 36, really. Like, let's be honest. Like, I was like a professional practicing woman in women's health before I was like, oh, here it comes. Like, but like when
Yeah,
you're a teen and when you're in your 20s, like you think the solution is for it to go away, right? You think
yeah.
and really that was a like a passed down piece from the generations above us as well, that this is like a massive nuisance in our lives. But I
Mhm.
think like conversations like the one you're having is to try and help break down that, and for women to actually like welcome that glimmer into what's going on with their health. Like, how do you start that conversation around educating women about their cycle, and what are you getting them to pay attention to that they often are surprised that is something that needs to be looked into?
Yeah, the top 3 things when I start this conversation, it's all about what's going on with you, first of all. Tell me the big problems or the things you think are problematic in your life. And almost across the board, women are shocked by heavy periods, period pain, and irregular cycles. They've been told forever and ever that those are totally normal, that they're not indicative of anything, that there's nothing that they can do about it except for take the pill, um, or some other form of hormonal birth control, possibly an IUD for the heavy periods, and that's really it. And so that's what's so shocking to them. And I always start everyone off with, are you tracking your cycle? Do you have any idea what's going on with your cycle? Because there's really no way that you can communicate in an educated fashion with your doctor if you don't know what the hell's going on with your body. Because we can look outside of ourselves all we want, but at the end of the day, if you're not an expert on what's happening with your cycle on a weekly, monthly basis, it's really difficult to get the help that you need. For instance, with heavy periods, if you're not paying attention to how many times you're changing pads or tampons or period underwear or your menstrual cup throughout your period, how are you able to communicate to your doctor that you have a heavy period? So it's really getting to know that information. Really, it's data on your body on a regular basis that is going to allow you, or it's going to create the freedom to get the help that you need to get. And if you don't have this information, you're just going to be stuck in an endless cycle of going to see the doctor, them suggesting the things that they know how to suggest, which I get, and you feeling perpetually dissatisfied with the care that you're getting.
Yeah, it's right. And that's an empowered conversation, right? That like
Yeah.
it matters what's going on. And finally, like if we talk about like medical gaslighting, like so much of the research on women's health actually leads with, and women don't really know what's happening with their body. And so therefore we should barely trust their opinion about what's happening with their body. Right? Like
Yes.
even the literature on PMS, which I'm all for women, like I'm all for proper studies being done, right? Where yes, we want to do a run in where we track these women for a bit. We want to try and minimize the placebo effect. All of that's cool with me, except in the introduction, it says women have no clue what's happening with their bodies. And as the medical practitioner reading that, it influences the way you start to think about your patients and about the information that they bring to you. And they'll say, I'm having horrific PMS. And you're like, that study that I read, it says she probably doesn't know if she has PMS.
That
Right.
is
And it like
insane.
discounts their
Yes.
experience, like even in the introduction of the study. And so, I mean, I hope, right, because it's true, like women often don't know when the last day of their menstrual period was. So maybe we don't know as much as we should, but let's lead with, hey, like we care about what's happening with your
Mhm.
hormones and we need to track it versus leading with, I know better than you, right, as the practitioner.
Yeah, I think this is so important to talk about because we don't know for the most part, like you said. We really don't. I mean, but and that, I feel like that falls on us to some degree, but really we live in a society that's set up to, like I was saying, make us fear our bodies because we're told from the very beginning, just don't get pregnant. And that's it. I mean, we're really offered nothing else. And I know from my experience talking to friends who have kids who are now starting to go through puberty that sex education really hasn't evolved very much since what we were going through that phase. And in thinking about this, there's so much as it relates to generational, this generational tie-in. Basically, I feel like for me, for instance, I was really excited about my period, and I remember I knew it was coming. Like I started to spot a little bit and I had pads. I was well set up. And a friend of mine, I remember her finding them in my backpack and she was like, "You got your period without telling me?" And very upset. You know how it is when you're 12. It's just like, just major. Major. Oh my God, it just makes me laugh because I was so upset. I felt really bad. And, I remember all of this and I remember thinking, oh, this is good because my mom had given me this book and I'd read the whole thing and I'd wanted more and I'd wanted to have a conversation with her. But I could clearly see at 11 years old that she was uncomfortable with the conversation and the questions I wanted to ask. And so that sort of made me uncomfortable. It made me know that I couldn't really talk to her about it. And so then, of course, I'm deferring to friends and I'm embarrassed to maybe talk to them about it because my mom has clearly been embarrassed about it. So when we think about how we communicate this to our children and to others, if we're taking care of children and we're not their parents or whatever, we really have to think about what is our own baggage around this. What's our own period story? What happened to us at puberty? Do we need to rewrite our period story or our puberty story so that it's not carried down? Because it really is like genetics, so to speak. I mean, we are passing down this belief system about our bodies and our menstrual cycles and the shame and all of it. And so, yeah, I really think that it's so important for us to be thinking back to what our experiences were like in puberty and as teenagers, before we, when we are thinking about how our bodies function and what our inherent beliefs are about them. And, that's going to change the conversation, not only with the people in your life, your kids, but also with your doctor as well.
It's interesting as you were recounting your story and you were in your early 20s there talking about the symptoms you were having. You're like, and then I talked to my doctor about the painful sex. And I'm like, she talked to her doctor about painful sex when she was 20? And I was like, holy shit, I'm proud of her.
Thanks. Honestly, I just was so desperate. I didn't know what else to do. I had no idea who to talk to. I was mortified. I will tell you that much. But yeah, I really was so desperate. It was completely born out of desperation. But thank you for saying that. I know I'm kind of,
Yeah,
I feel like I feel good.
you were on the like advocating for women's health back then and you didn't even know it, because I have women that are in their 40s that don't want to have a conversation about their painful sex, right? Or it's like, yeah, and then there's one more thing and they're whispering and they can barely come to terms with what they're about to say, right? Like and
Yeah.
yet like for so many, especially young women, those symptoms are actually leading us down a path to better diagnose them, right? Women who have painful sex in their 20s, we need to be having that conversation about things like endometriosis and STIs and pelvic inflammatory disease. But if they never go to the doctor and talk about it, then we've got a real problem.
Yeah, I know you're so right. And I just when I think about I kind of laugh because Hayden, my partner, he played sports in high school and college, and all the guys, they did everything together, right? Like they take showers together in the locker room, they joke about each other's penises, whatever. It's like just it's so ridiculous. They have no, I mean, I can't say they have no shame about it, but they seem to be way more uninhibited than we are. And he's told funny stories about that. And I just keep thinking, I don't know a lot of girls who would act that way, or really any, to be completely honest. And there's just so much shame, and there's the cycles, and our bodies are shrouded in secrecy. And when I think about, the stories I've heard over the years from women in their 60s and 70s who've had painful sex for their whole lives or never had an orgasm and didn't know that they could have a conversation with a doctor about that or see a pelvic physical therapist about it, or, all of these things that are, again, just not available to us because we don't talk about this. And how many women have come to me over the years, possibly thousands at this point, who said, I thought I was the only one. And this is why I just spill my guts on Instagram. And I know you do too, because if who we have to do this, I feel like it's our duty on this planet right now to make sure that women know, whatever country you live in, that it's not okay to not talk about this. We have to. It's our birthright to know this information.
And I always think like what amazing work women will do in the future if they don't feel like garbage half the month.
Oh my
Right?
God,
Like I
yes.
think like when we think about some of the barriers getting in the way of us being able to show up as our fullest selves, right? And
Yeah.
yet we get kind of pulled back by some of these hormone symptoms and experiences that we have, and because it's been normalized and because of medical gaslighting, like no one gets treatment, but that woman who's not getting treatment is the CEO of some environmental company. And I really need her to be able to show up every day so that the planet is better than the way we found it, right? Like that's how I think about my level of responsibility in this whole piece, is that there are women out there doing really important things, maybe only 50% of the time, because they're limited by their experience of their health. And if we not eliminated it, because I think there's some parts of our ebb and flow as far as like our hormones go that we probably should tune into, and we probably shouldn't be running at 110% all the time. Um, but if we felt well enough to just be able to do the things we wanted to do, how amazing the world would actually be.
Wouldn't it be incredible? I know, it's so true. When I hear these stories of women telling me that they're operating um relatively well for maybe 10 to 12 days out of the month, I just keep thinking of exactly what you said. How much of your life is being lost to period pain or severe PMS symptoms or whatever, something, some other problem, endometriosis symptoms, whatever it is. I've seen this so many times with clients over the years as well. When you fixed your period, you literally fixed your life. And it sounds so ridiculous, but it is so true. And again, we just don't realize how impactful changing your health is for the rest of your life, for every area of your life, your relationships, the work that you do in the world, everything. It really just doesn't even matter. Whatever I feel like if we are able to understand that and really grasp that concept, um, I feel like we're much more inclined to make the changes that we need to make. We're much more motivated to do it when we see the the ripple effect of it.
Hmm. And as women start, like, I think women often don't even realize what to expect when they start to like fix their period. Like, when you talk to women about this, like, when you think about like best case scenario, what does the perfect period look like?
I know. I kind of say there is no perfect period, just so everyone knows, because I think we tend to strive for things, as you well know, right? The perfect body or the perfect this or whatever. And so
Now
I
we're going
try
to get
to
all type A about our period. Here
our
we go.
periods exactly right. I just try to give you guys cut some slack and just let you know that you don't have to strive for this, but in an ideal world, what I like to see, and again, it varies depending on your history, your current health status, what you're eating, your stress, all of it. But ultimately, I really like to see a period that is somewhere between 3 and 7 days long, mostly 4 to 5 days, personally. And a period that doesn't cause pain that is debilitating. If you have a little bit of cramping that doesn't disrupt your life, that's no big deal. If you have cramping or pain that disrupts your life, or you need medication for it, more than two Advil, for instance, or two ibuprofen, that's potentially a problem. That's something to look into. If you're bleeding through your clothes every 1 to 2 hours, that's also a problem. On the flip side, if you're not bleeding a lot at all, like if you have 1 day of bleeding or 1.5 days, and you're mostly spotting, and your period is pink in color, for instance, it means that something's going on hormonally that you should probably be looking into. And then on the flip side of that too, if your period color is really dark, or it's brown, or it's pasty, it's not flowing, that's a sign that there's might be something up as well. And there again, I don't want to go into all the different reasons because I feel like we'd be here forever. I've written a bunch of this in my book, and it's all over my website and whatnot. But ultimately, that's why we have to really be paying attention. If our moods are so crazy in the lead up to our period that that our partner doesn't know whether angry us or happy us is going to walk through the door, that might be a problem too. So it's really something for us to pay attention to. And it's like I said, it's data. It's great information to have. My goddaughter got her period a few years ago, and she was young. I think she was maybe 11. And I was so jealous because she started tracking her cycle at 11 years old. And I just thought, oh my gosh, the data that this girl is going to have on her body, decades worth. I wish I could have that. And this is so good for you to be able to see what's happening. How are things changing as you get older? And is something shifting that you might not have noticed if you weren't paying attention? And so, yeah, I feel like those are kind of what I like to see in terms of the cycle length. 25 to 35 days without a lot of fluctuations. If you generally get a period every 26 days, I kind of like to see it, every 25 to 28 days. So not too much fluctuation there. And again, on the other end of the spectrum, 33, 34, 35 days, not a big deal if you're feeling good. And that's what everyone says, right? Well, I have this XYZ problem, Nicole. Am I normal? And I feel like everyone should know that you got to look at this as a whole, not as individual pieces. So you may have a period that's 7 days long and you feel amazing. Things are going really well. Everything else sort of checks checks out. It might just be that you tend to have a longer period, or it might be that there's something going on with your iron or your gut health or your estrogen or whatever. So it's really important for us to remember that we can't piecemeal this, and we do have to look at our bodies as a whole and our cycles as a whole to be able to determine if something's going on or if things are normal. And remember too that if you're slightly outside of the norm, but you're rocking life, then you should keep on doing that and not worry about this tiny thing that might not seem like it fits into the normal range.
That's such good advice. And I think that the other thing that I always want women to note, like pay attention to, is like one, we say one is not a trend, right?
Yes.
And sometimes I think when we do start to tune into these things and women will have this idea about what maybe a perfect cycle looks like, and then they will come in and they'll say, well, last month I bled for 4 days and then it stopped for a day and then it started again, right? Like it's
Yes.
like, so it's not that it's not important. It's important to write it down, but it also maybe is not an indication of pathology, right? And those little pieces that we're talking about there, they are sort of creating the story for how we feel about a woman's hormones and her health, but that the one-off, situation where you got one pimple one time, we just need to think about it as like as part of like the whole story and not like the end all be all. I think that that's also kind of an important piece, but all of those pieces that you were
Good.
saying now, what I was kind of hearing from you is that if women notice their hormones, that's not the worst, right? Like we may notice we're slower during the PMS time, we may notice our uterus when we're having a period because it's doing a lot of things, right? Like we might notice it, and that's maybe not a problem, but it's if it's interfering, right? If it's changing your behavior, if it's
Yeah.
affecting your relationships, if it's slowing you down to the point of maybe needing to take some time off work, like these are big flags that if you're altering your life because of your period, then there obviously needs to be some attention paid there and probably some support.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I completely agree with that. And I think it's so funny. It's true. It's like the one off thing that happened. Like you said, my period started and stopped last month. What happened? I noticed brown blood. What's going on? And obviously, we can't answer those questions, especially online. But I feel like, yes, like you said, pay attention for 3 to 6 months and see if these things are recurring, and make changes. I mean, this is something too, and we can get into this, but I feel like we've been led to believe that our bodies are really complicated when they're in fact, I mean, obviously how bodies work is pretty complicated. Not that we need to know all that, but generally we've been led to believe that female bodies are very complicated and too hard to understand and don't even bother, like you said about the research studies, just like women don't have any idea. And I'm of the belief that, well, I reject all of that, first of all. And I'm of the belief that we can be trusted to understand how our bodies work, to track our cycles, to know what's going on with them, and to recognize when there's a problem. And we should all know that and embody that. And furthermore, I think that when we have this information, we can do so much with it. And we don't need to have these huge interventions to start to feel better. And you well know this, right? It's like we could just have someone focus on getting more sleep. And that could be a game changer for them and for their menstrual cycles. So we don't realize like our menstrual cycle is very simple, similar to our circadian rhythm. I mean, they're all cycles. We're so cyclical. And yet we don't realize that if you don't get enough sleep, it will absolutely impact your menstrual cycle. Melatonin plays a role in how your menstrual cycle functions, how regular your cycle is, all of that. So what's amazing is we can make one small change in many cases and see really big results. But we've just been led to believe for so long that we need this massive intervention in order to fix these huge problems or these seemingly huge problems. But I always say that the problem is kind of the solution. The problem is your hormones. They're responding to things that are causing them to be disrupted. And those things are what you need to address. And so if we can start there, literally with one or two things, we might see pretty big changes. But it's it's one of those things where I think that a lot of us have tried so many things. We've gone to so many different doctors, tried multiple birth control options, we've tried medications, maybe we've tried a dietary change or something like that. And it's either not worked or it's been temporary or it's made things worse. and we lose faith. I think a lot of women have just lost faith in their bodies and their ability to heal or feel better. Um, and that's, I think that's what you and I and many of us who do this work are working against, right? Because we've got this problem in our society where women don't know what's going on with their bodies. They're not educated about them. And they also have tried many things and they feel as though they've lost a little bit of hope. So we're coming in and saying, well, actually, this might not be so hard. And going back to the basics, so many of us just don't even do the basics. We don't sleep enough. We don't eat enough food. We don't eat enough of the right food. There might be too much sugar that's causing all kinds of problems. It just like these basic, that we might be over exercising or not exercising enough. There's kind of a Goldilocks for everything, I think. And it just takes some experimentation and body literacy, really your body literacy.
Yeah, you said so many things in there that I think like that makes me think of like a where do I even start? Well, like the solutions are not that sexy, right? And I think that's one thing I would love to get back to in women's health is thinking about the basics, right? Because you're right, like your hormones are actually responding to the rest of your life, not the other way around, right? Women think that like
Yep.
their hormones are attacking them when they're really just trying to save you from yourself and your lack of sleep and too much alcohol and too much stress and lack of mindfulness and all your hormones are trying to save you from yourself.
So
And
true.
which makes those the solutions reversing all of those things that we've built our like castle on sand essentially, like we're all standing and we're vertical at work but maybe don't really feel that great, because the foundation is not really there. And that's where the solution is not that sexy, and so it's like, okay,
Mhm.
you need to go to bed at like 10. That's probably it. And it's not
Yeah.
shiny, new, exciting. Like I was pretty excited when they came out with like the wearables for sleep because it totally like sexified going to bed early because now people are like, "Oh, but I'm tracking my sleep on my Fitbit and so I'm going to go to bed at a reasonable time." It wasn't good enough when we just said, "Can you just go to bed at a reasonable time?"
Mhm.
Um, so it makes me think of that, right? A little bit that like we do have a little bit of the like shiny object syndrome where we want the solution to be exciting when often it's quite simple. And I
True.
don't know how we undo that, right? Because women are just so bombarded with other solutions, especially in the online space, that sound way more exciting than what I'm trying to do with them. I don't
Yes, I
like how do
agree.
you navigate that? Like what would you say to that woman?
I completely agree with everything you're saying. And I come up against this as well. And I would say a few things. I would say, first of all, when we try these other things, right? Because they're kind of like steps 5, 6, and 7. Meanwhile, steps 1 through 4 have not been handled at all. And usually I say something along the lines of, well, has any of that worked? Any of those later steps worked for you? And usually I get something along the lines of, well, it did initially, or yeah, it worked a little bit, but I'm still feeling XYZ. And so that's when we have the conversation about that foundation. Like you said, literally they're pillars, right? We talk about, and I talk about this in my book as well. And I say to them all too, yeah, like you said, there's nothing sexy about this. And I also say, like, this is just how these things relate to your period. So you can see very clearly how this stuff shows up when in your menstrual cycle. Um, but it's the same shit that everybody is talking about, generally speaking. And it's not super exciting, but it's going to move the needle in a major way, and it will absolutely change your life. And I like the idea of using the gadgets like a Fitbit, or using I use an Ava bracelet, amongst other things, because I really do like the gadgets. I track my cycle with 3 different gadgets. It's ridiculous, but I love the data. So, I use this Ava bracelet. It has my heart rate variability on it. It has how long I sleep on it, breathing rate, things like that, which all change according to where you are in your cycle. So it'll tell you whether you've ovulated based on that. Again, very cool stuff. So I feel like if we can sexify it a little bit, then people are really into that. And that's certainly, these little hacks are more, make people more inclined, and they make it more desirable to do. So I think that that's really helpful. And I say that if that's something that's going to help you, then great, let's do that. So you can track this, or these little, what do they call it, like biohacking? Yeah, so it's kind of like a biohacking type thing. So I feel like that's quite exciting to people. So we start there. But ultimately, I just start with food. I mean, and blood sugar. And that's another biohacking trick. I have people test their blood sugar, whether with a continuous glucose monitor or just pricking their finger. And I'm like, you can literally see what's going on inside, uh, and how it's showing up outside. And that's fascinating to women. I think they're finally able to see what the hell's going on inside, and why it's showing up this way. And I also think too, if we explain to them why they need to do this, like why this thing is happening to them, suddenly people are more intrigued, and they want to participate, versus just, okay, I have to lose 10 pounds, or my doctor said I have to exercise more, eat less, or, whatever insert thing that they have to do, and they have no idea why they're doing it.
Yeah, you're so right. And I do think that drawing those connections for women is great, because we haven't really done that. And we don't do that well in the medical field either, right? Is relating things back to like, hey, this is how your body works, like as a woman. And that's why this solution has and is going to be impactful for you, right? Because it helps women own what, like you said, like relating their sleep schedule back to their melatonin, back to their circadian rhythm, back to, oh, the number of women that I've talked to about like, the like sleep patterns and reproductive cycles of animals and the influence of melatonin on their reproductive cycle. I'm sure I've bored many a woman with that story, but it teaches you it's like, there's some animals that ovulate when the melatonin is high and they're sleeping through the winter and they have their babies in the spring. Like I give them this whole background, but it's because I want them to try and give up some of their night shifts and work during the day. And
Yeah.
it wasn't until I could frame it in like the context of their physiology did they get like actually kind of excited about it, right? And want to make that change. I
Yeah.
want to talk a little bit about the stress piece because you opened with your story starts when you're 11,
Yeah.
right? And it's interesting because and what I was saying at the very beginning there is like that there's when you're in your 20s, there's your symptoms. And when we're in those years, we blame the symptoms that women are going through on their circumstances. And this happens when you're in your 40s too, right? They're like, well, of course you're depressed. Your kids are older and you're looking after your parents and your job's busy. They never look like deeply beneath that. And the same happens in your 20s. Like, well, of course you've got acne. Of course this, of course that. But then there's the other side of your story where when you're 11, you have to experience like the deepest trauma that I can think of for an 11-year-old. And yet that was not really contextualized with what you went through health wise at that time.
Not at all. And it actually took me many years to really put two and two together. Um, yeah, because it started with the gut health issues, and then the period issues came after that. And my diet was very meat and potatoes because that's just what I wanted to eat. And probably because of the gut health issues. And so, it was just a perpetual cycle, that led to more and more health problems. And I was one of those kids when I think back now. And I grew up in Antigua, small island in the Caribbean. So it was a nice childhood. It was no air pollution or any of that stuff. It was, it was very healthy, generally speaking. And but I always had little issues that my sister didn't have. So like my stomach hurt a lot. And when I would get nervous, I would throw up. And I remember being like a nervous kid and having skin issues and just little things that I think like today would probably be even worse just because kids nowadays are exposed to so much more shit. And so, whereas then it just wasn't the case. So it was little things that then I think became massive things after going through this situation where my dad died really suddenly. And then of course, you couple that with puberty and teenage years and eating junk, and it spiraled. And it really wasn't until I saw that acupuncturist in my early 20s that things started to shift. So it was really a decade of all this stuff combined. And it wasn't really until my mid to late 20s that I finally started addressing the emotional component of all of this that was causing all these problems, because I just felt like I was living in that place of trauma, living it out over and over again. Whenever anything bad happened, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. And the way I perceived things and my stress perception, and then also my relationships, everything felt dysfunctional. And it all related back to that experience. I felt like everyone was going to leave me. Anyone who cared was going to leave, and they weren't going to stick around, and I wasn't worthy. And I could go on and on. And that, when I think about the stress, and when I was researching for the book and just been researching over the years, and the effect that external stress, no matter what it is, has on our brain, our hypothalamus, our pituitary, our ovaries, and how it's such an unbelievable protection mechanism based on, thousands and thousands of years of evolution, millions really, of evolution, and that the fact that it's helping our bodies to not get pregnant in a time of famine or danger or whatever, and how that's been completely flipped on its head now, because in the society we live in, stress is ubiquitous. It's completely normal. Being maxed out is totally okay and perpetually normalized. Drinking that gallon of coffee in the morning is no big deal. So all of these external stressors that our body doesn't even know are any different to being chased by a lion, as you know, are now the things that we all do, and it's expected of us. And yet they're the things that are causing all of the cycle and fertility problems. And so until we recognize that these stressors, all these things, are really the crux of the problem, we just can't, we're not going to get any better. And that's really an evolutionary mismatch, isn't it? It's really difficult. Like, how do you, it's like a radical thing, isn't it? To go against what your society is doing, what everyone in the society is doing. It's very difficult to be healthy and have a healthy cycle and healthy fertility in our society now, is what it feels like. I'm not trying to be gloom and doom, but it does feel that way.
It does. If women would have to take, like, I like that term, radical responsibility. I don't know where it came from. Someone
Yeah.
famous said it, I think.
Yes,
But
I
I
love
like
it too.
that term, right? It's like we need women, or we need to empower women, that they need to take radical responsibility for their health and their life, because floating down the river of status quo is not actually going to get them to be their best self, right? When they visualize their best future self, but they're in the river, the lazy river of, the status quo,
I love that.
that's not actually where you're sailing.
Yeah, it's
And
true.
so it's, but you're right. Like, and it's the part about the whole stress piece that I find so fascinating is that the research is really clear, right?
Mhm.
Trauma increases PMS, PMDD, postpartum depression. Trauma worsens the pain of your endometriosis. We've got studies on allostatic load, and not just in athletes, but the impact that excessive stressors on the body, both physiological, like calorie deficit or overtraining, or psychological, have on ovulation. The research is really clear. It's one of the most clear things we have when it comes to research on female physiology, is the impact that stress and trauma has on your likelihood of being diagnosed with another pretty significant women's health concern, but we don't screen for it, right? Like, I'm excited. I want to hear about your doctor's visit, if you're willing to share about your
Oh,
doctor's
totally.
visit from last week. But like, as a, going to the doctor in your 30s and 40s with some concerns, we should be screening women for trauma. We should be asking if they've gone through the healing that you have gone through for the traumas that they've experienced in their life, because if they haven't, and even if they have, it actually increases their likelihood of struggling with hormonal concerns. And yet that's not something we're asking at we're not asking our patients if they've had trauma in their life.
Yeah, this is so good. This brings up so many things. I think the first thing is what you said about, going to your doctor and not being screened. I mean, girl can't even get her hormones tested, for crying out loud. It's like screening for trauma.
Yeah,
Are
how
you kidding
ill-equipped.
me?
The doctor's not even equipped to order their hormone panel, let alone screen for trauma. You're right.
Yeah. Mine last week told me, well, I don't really test hormones because hormones fluctuate. I'm like, yeah, no kidding. They fluctuate. That's what they do. But they could be out of whack depending on where you are in your cycle. By the end of the visit, she said to me, okay, well, you just tell me what hormones you want to test, because it sounds like you know more about this than I do. What planet do we live on that this conversation even happened? I can't even get over it. And I just feel like we're doing such a disservice to women when they feel like they go and they know something's wrong and they're told things like that. Like, we don't test for hormones because they fluctuate. Or, she told me, it's funny. I've been talking about this. So I did a hormone test recently, an at-home hormone test from a company that I use, and my FSH and LH were higher than I'd anticipated them being. I was a little shocked, but then I'm not so shocked because the last 2 years have been kind of insane. And so I was like, okay, I really want to see this doctor. I have to have a pap smear. I haven't had one in nearly 3 years. And in the US, the guidelines are over 40. It's 5 years for a pap smear. She didn't want to give me a pap smear because it's been 3 years and I'm over 40. And I was like, I'm here and I ain't coming back. So please, let's just do this already. But it was so interesting. Her biggest concern, even though I'm telling her about this FSH LH situation, my prolactin was definitely higher than it was 2 years ago when I last tested this. Everything was perfect 2 years ago. And she was much more concerned about me getting a mammogram than looking into the situation. She said, oh, well, you're in perimenopause. You're 41 years old. This is totally expected. It's totally normal. I'm like, but I'm having symptoms and this to me doesn't feel normal. And I also wrote a book about this. Like, I never imagined I would have to say this to anybody, but I did. And I
You
feel
had to
like such
pull
an
the book
obnoxious
card.
jerk.
Yeah.
I just did because I feel like it's so obnoxious to do, but I just did because I was like, okay, I'm not getting anywhere with this lady. And she is not having any of this hormone testing business. And she's not listening to what I'm saying to her about my concerns. And so I really needed to have that experience because the last OBGYN I saw was someone I had seen for years, and she was very open to all the things I did. She knew I was a weirdo and, I didn't do all this stuff. So that was fine. But so this was the first time in a really long time I'd had one of those weird gaslighty experiences. And I needed to have it to be able to relate continually to all the women I serve, because I hear this same version of this story, different cast of characters, almost on a daily basis. And so anyways, I basically got nowhere. She wouldn't do anything for me, but give me the recommendation for the mammogram, and that was the end of it. So, yeah, that was basically it for me.
Oh my gosh. It sounds like, well, I don't even actually know when the last time was I went to the doctor, but I do feel like I went in with a list of things that I wanted tested and then could only get 50% of them again, even though I also was having symptoms that I wanted to be addressed. And I did leave with a requisition for a Holter monitor.
A what monitor?
A Holter monitor because I was having palpitations. Um,
Oh,
but not all of the blood tests that I wanted done. So I
oh,
find that
girl.
very interesting.
I didn't get all of the blood tests either. And she didn't understand the testing on the progesterone testing 5 to 7 days post ovulation. That went right over her head. I was like, we can't test progesterone on day 3 because there's no progesterone. And she kind of seemed like she got that, but this is incredible to me. I don't know what a women's health clinic is supposed to do exactly. This is where I'm at now in my journey, questioning all of this stuff.
Well, I would love, Nicole, if you could. There's a couple things I want to sort of finish off with. Like, one, I want you to let our listeners know how they can connect with you. You post more memes than I do about periods, so I feel like it's a shoe-in for everybody to go follow you on Instagram. So I'd love if you could share where that is, and the information about your book, so that people can get connected there as well. But I also want to I want some parting words for our listeners, essentially, like on what your mission is in women's health. Yeah, I'd love to know kind of what like your parting thoughts are there for our audience.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the first thing is I'll tell everyone where you can find me. So I'm on Instagram. It's Nicole M like Madeline Jardim, and you can find me on my website as well. It's NicoleJardim.com. I have a blog. I have programs. My book is also on there. It's called Fix Your Period. And when it comes to the parting words, I think if there's anything that people take away from this, it's that your bodies are incredible. They are not, your menstrual cycle is not a design flaw. It's not something that is to be perpetually normalized. If you feel you're experiencing problems that are outside the norm of what you've experienced, and to trust yourself, trust the wisdom of your body, trust that your body is sending you signals and that you know how to interpret them. This is not rocket science. we're fighting against a system that has basically made it very difficult for us to understand what's going on with our bodies. And like Jordan said, take radical responsibility for yourself and your health, and remarkable things will happen for you.
Amazing. Thank you, Nicole. You have such a great way of making the content for women so relatable and accessible. And that's when I think about what our bigger visions are with this podcast. I mean, we know we can't talk one on one to every woman out there. I want women to feel equipped to be able to march into their doctor's office and hopefully get all the blood work, even though we couldn't accomplish it. But to be able to have to develop the language, to develop the knowledge about their own bodies, and so that they can feel like they can confidently navigate healthcare for themselves. That's really what my big goals are. And I feel like you fit that so perfectly, Nicole. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Jordan. It was great.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.